I've often had students come up to me and say, Paul, I'm thinking of buying a car. I know you used to be a dodgy second-hand car salesman, so can you give me some advice of what I should be looking for? So what we're doing in this video, I've invited a friend of mine, John Greenwood, who is a car salesman for Jaguar Land Rover, to discuss what to look for when buying a car. And we're using my car, a Jaguar X-Type, as an example. Now, I know students won't buy Jaguar X-Types, but it's a good idea to look at the things that John's looking at to help you to decide whether the car is good enough or not. Now, I also know that students often say to me that it is Dad who helps them buy the car. Now, I'm sure your dad is a fantastic dad, but he may not be the best person to ask when buying a car. So hopefully what John tells you will be good guidance, because you know something, buying a car is littered with minefields and potholes, and you want to avoid them. And in fact, you know, when you're driving along the road and you see a pothole, you try to avoid it, and then you see another one, and by avoiding one you hit another, and that's what it's like sometimes buying a car. So anyway, thank you, John, for being here with us.
Welcome.
Thank you. The first thing that students have to decide really is to whether to buy the car from a private buyer or online through a trader. Can you give some advice on what might be best or better, or what are the pitfalls with both?
Pros and cons. Basically, you've got pretty much three options. At the one end of the scale, you've got a main dealer who will sell new and used cars. Usually got a very nice showroom, expensive coffee, nice tiles and chairs, but you pay for the privilege. Pros, you've usually got the backup that goes along with that reputation for that dealership and that franchise. Also, they should hopefully be experts on the products they're selling. Downsides, potentially you will be paying towards the top end of the market for that particular car because of the backup, the service, and what it costs to operate that franchised dealership.
Can I just ask you there, you mentioned about you've said, talking about the franchise and the main dealers. Of course, these are in the main going to be the more expensive, the top end of the market.
Indeed.
Not the sort of the lower end of the market.
No, depends what you're looking for, and I'll sort of touch on that in one of our other points in terms of budget and what's the best way to get the best value for your money for whatever you have to spend. So at the one end, as we said, towards the top end generally of the market, you've got what I'd call main dealers. Somewhere in the middle you have what I would refer to as traders, some of whom will operate from their own premises, perhaps not as elaborate as the main dealer. Again, what will vary there is the level of backup and support. Some will have their own workshop facilities, some will literally just sell used cars. Somewhere in between, perhaps in one of the grey areas of what I would refer to as home traders. They'll generally tend to be the chaps that will buy and sell cars to make a profit. They'll try and spend the minimum amount in terms of reconditioning or preparing the cars. Some of the less scrupulous ones will pose as private sellers, whereby because you have far less legal comeback when buying a car privately, if they don't tell you or don't officially operate as a trader or a dealer, they're hoping to avoid any possible comeback.
Can I just say something about that? My student family members will be well aware that I have this saying, accept nothing, believe no one, check everything. So the ABC. How much do you think these sort of on the borderline dodgy dealers may be very dodgy, and what can we do to check them out? I know what you mean, because they're trying to cut corners, they're trying to save on costs.
They're trying to circumvent the system. Some of them are absolutely genuine, honest people who have a day job, for want of a better description, and will buy and sell cars, perhaps through some trade contacts they may have at a dealer who allows them to buy part exchange vehicles. Some will maybe purchase vehicles at auction. The oldest trick in the book, once you've got to the point where if you've seen a vehicle for sale and you're contacting the vendor, who would appear to be, from the description, a private seller, oldest trick in the book, when you ring up, "Hi, I'm calling about the car." If someone says, "Which one?" there's not many private sellers who have a fleet of cars for sale at any one time.
So, a very good light bulb moment.
Indeed. So, I'm calling about the car. Don't give a description. Don't say which model. Wait for the person on the other end of the phone to volunteer that information.
And then you'll know, if they say which one, that they are actually a trader and they're pretending to be a private buyer.
Chances are that could be the case.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean rule out that car or that individual. It might be a great car, but it just means proceed with caution. Your other option, either, as we've said, main franchise dealer, a dealer with premises, someone trading from home or from just a patch of ground somewhere, or your final option is a private seller, i.e. someone who is selling either their own or a relative's car. Might be they've traded the car, they've purchased a car and don't wish to trade theirs in. Might be son or daughter who's basically no longer using that car and upgraded. Relative who's passed away.
I've actually seen, on that point, I've seen quite a few cars where they say the relative is deceased, but actually you really, unless you have a look at death records, you can't really trust that, can you?
No, it's a tricky one again. I mean, the overriding thing, whoever you're buying from, whether it's private or a dealer, ignore the car for a moment, the person you're dealing with. There is a saying in the motor trade which is people buy from people. If you get bad vibes from someone, you feel in some way they're untrustworthy, or you feel that they're not telling you everything or evading your questions, go with your gut, because generally you're going to be right. So again, when you speak to that person, if it's my father's car, sadly passed away or what have you, generally when you get speaking to them for a while, asking more questions, you'll get a feeling whether that's genuine or not.
Yeah, I know you've bought cars from private buyers, sellers, haven't you, in the past for yourself?
I have.
And were you convinced that they were genuine, or what sort of signals did you get that made you convinced they were genuine?
What I've tended to do, as you know, I'm a fellow Jaguar enthusiast, and some of the cars that Jaguar make that I'm enthusiastic about are no longer new enough to be in the dealer network. So if you want to find a good example, I actually, when I'm out there looking for one of these cars for myself, I'm just a buyer. The fact I'm in the trade has no bearing. Again, gut feeling. When you speak to someone, I don't think it's just because I'm in the trade, it's just in general. I get a sense when I'm speaking to someone, are they genuine, are they volunteering information? When you actually go to look at the vehicle, have they taken a bit of trouble to prepare it? Have they at least given it a wash, or is it full of empty Costa coffee cups and sweet wrappers? Again, that's not a reason to discount the car and sort of not buy it, but it's all those things. Body language, eye contact, do they evade questions or give you an honest answer? They're all the things that, whether you're buying one from a trader, a dealer, one of the salesmen at a dealer, or a private individual, they're all things that will serve you well, because the car itself might be great, but the person you're dealing with is also part of the equation.
It's interesting what you say about eye contact. I find that looking people in the eyes, you can soon see if they're shifty because they look away from you, and that's a real signal, a no-no. Anyway, I want to recap. So, in terms of where you might buy the car, you could go to a main dealer, which is a franchise dealer, franchised by the manufacturers. You can go to a trader who would usually buy the part exchanges from these dealers, who trades from a site. You could go to a trader who sells from home but beware, they might try to be disguising themselves as a private person rather than a trader. And finally, from a private person. Okay, let's move on, John. Can I ask you about the research that students should participate in when they are looking for a car?
Okay, now, for someone like myself, I've been interested in cars since before I was in my teens. It's not so much research, it's a labour of love. For someone for whom cars are not the be-all and end-all, they've maybe got other far more important things going on in their life, I'm not saying you should become an expert, but some points or some factors to look into when you're contemplating buying a car. So for example, one of the most important ones is work out your budget. Be realistic. Is that a cash amount that you have to spend up to a certain price? Is it a monthly payment that you're sure you can afford, bearing in mind the cost of them running the car? Are family helping out with the purchase? Are you paying for it using part-time work? Look at those factors. So first, have a realistic budget.
On that point, can I ask you, John? I mean, a lot of people think that buying a second-hand car, you pay for the price, particularly if you go to a reputable dealer, that, say it's £2,000, that will be the end amount, no more money needs to be spent. But as you and I both know, with older cars, you can never guarantee that you're not going to have to spend money. I mean, I've got an old X-Type, which you're going to have a look around in a minute, but I sort of allocate, including things such as insurance and tax and maintenance, around £1,000 a year. Would you say that's a reasonable amount to allocate for spending on the car to maintain it?
It's not a bad idea to budget for that. Again, particularly people for whom a car is a means to an end, not an obsession or an interest in itself, do tend to underestimate things that are wear and tear items. If you imagine how many hundreds of components in a motor vehicle, some of them are things that are stationary and don't wear out, but things like tyres, brakes, suspension components, wheel bearings, they're all things that can at some point fail. And there's not necessarily, things like tyres, you can keep an eye on the tread and know that you're going to get a few thousand miles out of them, so budget for replacement. Other things, not necessarily. You've got to allow for the fact that no car is at its best if it isn't serviced when it should be, and someone with some degree of mechanical knowledge takes a look over the car to look for any impending problems. Basically, factoring in insurance, which is an increasingly large cost, fuel, touching on some of the notes I've made here, basically plenty of information online, which that's the beauty these days, there is so much information freely available on the internet. So looking at what sort of mileage you cover, is a petrol or diesel car a better option for you? What type of journeys you're doing. A lot of diesel cars aren't really great news if you're only doing very short journeys where the car never gets up to proper temperature. A lot of them now have quite sophisticated emission control systems to make them much more cleaner and environmentally friendly, but they only tend to work when the car's getting a decent run. So if you're doing 5 miles a day, what you might find is a diesel's not the right car for you, potentially. You've also then got to consider, is it going to be a car that if you're regularly travelling into city centres, are you going to be going into low emission zones, and is that car going to be one that's going to...
That's a bigger problem now with older cars, isn't it? That's a very important thing.
It is indeed. I mean, the agenda is really to get the older, dirtier cars off the road, and one of these is by making it harder or more expensive to use them in certain areas where there is heavier traffic. It means that those cars are either not purchased in those areas or go to the scrapyard sooner and so on.
So if a member of the student family is buying a car, they should be able to find online whether that actually was one where if they go into these emission controlled areas,
Yeah.
where they'd have to pay for going into these areas.
Indeed.
So they just put the make of the car
Yeah,
online.
usually if you do a Google search, other search engines are available. If you do a search on, if you, let's say, Birmingham introduce a low emission zone, Birmingham low emission zone, qualifying vehicles or criteria,
Right.
it'll lead you down the rabbit hole, it'll give you that info, and usually from the registration number of a vehicle, it will identify whether it is qualifying.
And you should be aware that there are different types of zones, so different areas of the country. I think they go from A to D, and the higher, either, I can't remember which way, but whichever way it is, the higher the requirements are. So a D may be much stricter than an A, or vice versa. You'd have to check up on that. So do be careful about that, particularly if with universities, many universities in city areas, it may restrict the use of the vehicle that you buy.
Indeed. Again, on the subject of research, if you narrow it down to a particular model or models that you think will fit your criteria, there's pretty much online buying guides for virtually every popular make and model of car out there, which will normally highlight the things to look out for specifically on a particular model, something that previous owners have found to be a common issue. Also, it might reveal things in there that mean it's not suitable for you, so they're a useful source of information. Online reviews, things like Auto Trader, quite often if you look at a particular used car for sale, they don't just have a review for, say, it's a trader, they don't just have a review for that dealer selling the car and how they interact with customers, they also have a review of that particular model of car from genuine owners and experience on running them as a used vehicle.
Interestingly, actually, I think Auto Trader are one of the better ones for the reviews, because I know I went to put up on a review. Actually, it was for you, John, but they said it was too personal, so they wouldn't allow me to put it up. Which
Oh, good grief! There you go.
So, but that does show that they check. Most of these review sites do not check. They just accept.
No, I was going to say Trustpilot, things like that. Sometimes the numbers can get manipulated, shall we say. Again, on the subject of research, the internet is your friend. The one that I find absolutely fantastic, that there's not really any dodging, the DVLA maintain an MOT history check. So armed only with the registration number of a vehicle, you can actually look, did it pass or fail? If it had any advisory items which wouldn't fail an MOT but will require attention. Mileage, so you can check going back to the last several MOTs to see whether there's any discrepancies. If the mileage suddenly went lower this year, something a little strange there with the mileage. I find that's fantastic because you're armed with that information before you're speaking to the seller, whether it's a garage or a private individual. If you're phoning up and saying, right, is the car still available? Yes, it is. Right, I've just done the MOT history check online. It came up with advisory saying 2 tyres were very near the legal limit and there's play in a ball joint. Have all those items been rectified? It lets people know that you've done your homework, and maybe they're less likely to try and cover other things up or not mention them.
Okay, let's recap where we've got to on our research. So, a number of things. Firstly, decide what your budget is. Don't forget with your budget to account for the fact that you're going to have to repair and pay for repairs on an older car, as well as tax and insurance and fuel, of course. If you're deciding whether to buy a petrol or diesel, remember that diesels tend to like to be taken on long runs rather than too much around town and around the city. And most importantly, check the history of the car on the DVLA. And it is a really simple thing, as John said, because I've done that to check the cars. It tells you what's been, whether they've passed an MOT, whether they've been advisories. You've got lots of details. And as John said, with advisories, you know, it may be that that will come up as something you have to repair in the future. So you've got all those things that you need to consider budgeting for. John has done a test of my car to see what needs doing on my car, and we're going to go through the things that he looked at in order to see whether my car, a Jaguar X-Type, which of course you're not likely to buy, I know, but it gives you a good guidance as to what to do. And actually he's used a checklist which he uses when customers are coming in with a part exchange to check their car before he values it as a part exchange vehicle. So John, let's have a trip round my car. And you started with the front. So tell me what you were looking at as you were going around the car, and what things you found wrong, and how much it might cost as well.
Indeed. Well, generally, doesn't maybe necessarily need to be as process driven as the way I do it. It's just force of habit, because it's what I do for a living. But it's a good idea to have a checklist. It's also a good idea to take photos on your mobile phone while you're looking around the car, because if then it is one of interest and you don't necessarily buy it then and there, you can always refer back to the photos to refresh your memory. So, looking around the car, first thing we tend to do, I would normally do a complete circuit of the car at a reasonable distance, probably 6 to 10 feet, just looking if there's anything immediately that stands out to me, any panels that don't line up, any mismatch of colour on panels that might indicate bodywork's been painted or replaced. Then I'd move in closer. Again, you can start where you want, but I usually start at the front. So, usual thing, any car, even a couple of years old, driven on UK roads, chances are there's going to be some stone chips. Generally, they can be small or large, they can be touched in to minimise the appearance. So on your car, it's done 110,000 miles, which for the age of the car is quite low, but obviously that's 110,000 miles on UK roads. A few stone chips there, nothing to be alarmed about, and certainly far less than you'd see on many cars of this age, but again, something to look at. What I'll then do is move down each side of the car and then front and rear. So moving down, say, the driver's side, I would usually sight down the side of the car, knelt down from the front wing to the back wing. You can look for any discrepancies in panel gaps, do the doors line up, any signs of ripples or dents. Also, depending on lighting conditions, it'll also sometimes tell you if one panel doesn't match, it might have had paint. Again, depending on the age of a car, finding a car that hasn't had even minor repairs at some point is quite tricky. That's the nature of driving a car. Short of a brand new one, you never really know. You're just looking for signs of something that's not been done well, or something that will affect the value of the car when you come to resell it. So, looking at your car, nothing down the driver's side at all fine there. You'll notice on the video I look at the wheels and also the tyres. You can quite inexpensively purchase a tyre tread depth gauge that'll tell you exactly how much. Again, just from experience, you'll say I wasn't using one, I'm just using a finger into the tread. I'm usually within a millimetre based on that.
And isn't there an important thing about even wear on the tyre as well?
Well, that's the other thing to check as well. You'll notice I was reaching in under the wheel arch across the tyre to check if there's any signs of uneven wear. It's not just a case of checking the outer, the middle, but the inner as well.
And if it does have uneven wear, what does that signify? I mean, sometimes it's only the wrong pressure in the tyre, which can be rectified, but it can be more serious.
It can. It can just be wrong tyre pressure, running them too low or too high. In general terms, if it's wearing on the edge, it can be too low. If it's wearing down the centre of the tyre more than the outer or inner, that's generally the tyre's been run over inflated, i.e. the centre of the tyre is making contact with the road first. Uneven wear, it can be something as simple as the tracking or alignment, which is basically the...
That's on the front wheels?
On the front wheels, that can be something relatively simple. If it's absolutely excessive, you've got a tyre that's like new in the centre and the outside edge, and yet on the inner edge is basically bald, it's down to no tread, that could signify it's either wildly out of track or alignment, or it could be other deeper suspension issues.
Which can be very expensive.
Can
of
be
course.
expensive.
Would you recommend a student to walk away if there's something like that? Because they're not experienced, unless they've got a mechanic who knows a lot about the cars, would you suggest they walk away on something like that?
Again, you've got to take each one on its own merits. If there's a lot of the type of car you're looking at around, move on to a better example. And at this point I should add, unless you come across what you are absolutely sure you are not going to find a better one, have a look at a few.
Yeah.
Because the first one you look at that you think, well, this is pretty good, this is as good as I'm going to get for the money. If the next one you look at is actually far better and it's the same price, you're going to be kicking yourself that you bought the first one. So sometimes it's very easy to get carried away in the excitement of a new car.
Especially if it's your first car.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I'm sure if it's your first car, you will be so desperate to get that first car and you think, oh yeah, that's the one I want. Don't be like that.
No, indeed. So also, well, at this point I would also say, unless you can afford to be, either financially or there is enough choice, don't be absolutely specific. The cheaper the used car you're buying, there will be compromises to be made. So, for example, you might set out saying, I want a metallic light blue 3-door Ford Focus with a 1.8 petrol engine and leather trim. If there are 200 of those for sale that meet that on Auto Trader, chances are you're going to find one. If on the other hand there's not,
Half a dozen.
yeah, indeed, and they're all 300 miles away. So have a bit of flexibility. If you're buying new, needless to say, you can specify exactly what you want. If on the other hand you are buying a used car, sometimes you don't get exactly what you want, but make sure it ticks the main boxes for you.
As you continue around the car, what other things do you find? I noticed you go around the back and then around both sides, in fact, don't you?
Well, I did go around the car. Back to things like tyres, I was not only checking for wear, but I was also checking that there were the correct tyre sizes on the car. Now, it's rare, but again, when someone's running a car on a budget, what you might find is they don't necessarily put a new tyre on, they may put a part-worn tyre on. So, again, you've got to take each on its merits, but if it, say, had 2 different size front tyres, that's not a good thing.
No. And also, don't they have the date when they were manufactured as well?
That's another point, because now on an MOT test, any tyre which is 10 years old or over, even if it has legal amounts of tread, is an MOT fail.
Right.
Now on the tyre sidewall, there is a DOT code, which is usually 4 digits. The first 2 are the week the tyre was produced, and the second 2 are the year. So for instance, 2019 would be a tyre manufactured in week 20 of 2019. Yeah. So check for obvious signs of, say, the rubber perishing as well.
Oh, and cracks in the tyre sidewall as well.
Indeed, cracks in the tyre sidewall. They're all things we look for. Not necessarily, obviously, we spot them straight away because we're so used to looking at tyres. The other thing was the alloy wheels. A lot of cars now have alloy wheels, even, sort of fairly modest specification cars. If a car's just got plastic wheel trims and they're scuffed, broken, cracked or missing, depending whether you're replacing with manufacturers or just some from down the local car accessory shop, they're easy and cheap to replace. Alloy wheels, again, if they're just cosmetic scuffs and scrapes, there's plenty of companies who will come out to you to refurbish those and make them look like new again if it's something that bothers you. Probably allow anywhere between, £50 and £100 per wheel, depending on the type of alloy. If it's something more serious, large chunks of the alloy wheel missing or buckles, they can all be things that could also contribute to uneven tyre wear.
Right, yes, yeah.
So, looking at yours, on the driver's side, I noticed 2 minor scuffs. Certainly, again, nothing unexpected for the age and mileage of the car, but if you were looking round, it's just something that you'd make a note of. Moving round to the back of the car, only thing I spotted there, that over time, one of the letters on the boot on the X-Type, the Y has gone.
Not really much to think
No,
about.
I was going to say that the letter Y was missing. But
Oh, John, goodness me, you're being a bit pedantic here.
I am
aren't you?
here, yeah. I must admit there wasn't a lot for me to pick up. You could have found me a worse condition used car. To
Oh,
make
could
mine.
I? So,
Yeah,
so you say I look after it quite
yeah,
well?
absolutely.
Oh,
It's been looked after. You
for
could have-
sale for £2,000 if you want to buy. But no, I'm not selling.
So yeah, little things there. You'll also notice at one point I opened the boot. Now what I'd normally do at that point, 2 things. One, you're checking for whether the spare wheel, if it should have one, or tyre repair inflator and foam is there. Locking wheel nut, if it isn't, probably worth asking the seller, have you got the locking wheel nut if it has one. Number of people that end up, they buy it first time they need a tyre, no locking wheel nut, and then you're really struggling for somebody to get the wheel off, and you're paying for somebody to, and risk damage to your alloy wheels getting the wheel off to change a tyre.
Well, I know you weren't able to lift it because I'd had stuff on the boot.
Indeed.
So but you can trust me, it is all there.
Yeah.
And there's no back end damage. as
No,
well.
that's the other thing to look at. The other reason that we look under the carpet or the board in the boot, usually if the car's been in a rear end impact, you can see signs of where it's been straightened and repaired. Difference in paint colours, or they don't have the wax on the seams, or you can actually see creases where it's been straightened. Again, this is something else to touch on, which is quite important. If you get to the point where you're going to potentially purchase that car, you can either take the risk that it's genuine, depending on how much you're spending. The less you're spending, probably the less it's worth doing this, but there are plenty of online checks which will tell you for a fee whether that car has any record of ever being stolen and recovered, whether it's listed as having been on the insurance register, which can be something as simple as stolen and not recovered for a while after the company's paid out. It can be accident damage that basically still allows the car to be repaired and put back on the road safely, but they're all things that impact on the resale value.
Yeah. As a general rule, though, for students, would you recommend that they walk away from a category? Isn't it D, C, D, and
Well,
E?
the categories used to be Category A and B. Category A has to be crushed, can't even be sold for parts. Category B, parts that are safe can be salvaged, but the car can't buy it, go back on the road. You then used to have Category C and Category D. Category D was generally light damage or stolen and recovered. Category C was heavier damage but still suitable to put the car back on the road. The last 2 categories have now changed. C and D have become S, meaning structural damage,
Oh, right.
i.e. so it was major
yeah,
accident damage, and Category N for non-structural damage. Very imaginative.
Very.
So, if you see a car that's Category S or Category N, A, it should have quite a significant impact on the car's for sale price compared to a similar car that isn't on that register. Unless you're a car person, it's probably more prudent to walk away unless the car is an absolute bargain.
And is it not the case that actually they attract an insurance premium?
Some insurance companies won't insure them at all,
Right.
which can basically limit the scope of quotes you can get, so potentially Hobson's choice on who you can insure with. Generally, if they will insure them, they'll basically not pay out the full market value of a car that hasn't previously been a total loss. Their argument is, well, if it's written off again, it can't be worth what an undamaged one was because it's already been written off once.
I think as a student you should be very wary of these categories, whatever category, whether it's the old category or the new category. Personally, because of the uncertainties, I would avoid them actually.
You can have all sorts of potential future issues. If you can work on cars yourself and know exactly what you're getting into, fine. Personally, it'd need to be a very, very unusual car on that list for me to even consider it at the right price.
I also noticed when you were looking around that you're looking at the gaps in the doors, and you also felt the sills and round the wheel arches for rust.
Again, not as much of a problem as it used to be years ago. However, you've two issues to look at with a car that what eventually leads to a car no longer being economically viable to keep on the road. One can be the mechanical or potential mechanical issues or cost of repair if something major fails. The other one can be the actual body structure of the car. The engine might be fine, the gearbox, the suspension might all be great, but if what's around them is corroding, if it's minor corrosion, you can nip it in the bud, or just run it until the point where it becomes serious enough that you're advised it's an MOT fail, and you can look at it as I've had my money's worth out of it. You've also got to factor in the potential safety aspect if it's structural corrosion. So what I was doing there, I couldn't get under the car. If I was being absolutely paranoid, I could have probably got a phone on a selfie stick and just ran it underneath.
And not a bad idea, really, isn't it? Just
these days, the technology's there.
Yeah, you can. Yeah,
Rather than lying in the road and potentially getting yourself run over, if you do that, and when you come to view it back, there's a gigantic hole under where the driver sits.
And what's more, you can actually show friends and say, or somebody who's a bit more knowledgeable, you can show them and say, look, this is what was on. What do you think?
Yeah, does that look what you'd expect? Now, the signs of some surface.
Interestingly, I've seen on Auto Trader, some dealers will do a film of the underneath if they're very, very confident of the car.
Indeed.
Not many do that.
Indeed, not many. The problem is a lot of the components under the car are made of cast iron, steel, basically ferrous metals, so they get surface corrosion once the initial paint wears off. As long as it's not structural, if you go around searching for a used car of a certain age, if you look for one that's got absolutely no underside corrosion, you'll struggle. What we're talking about is, rather than the components that bolt on being slightly rusty, we're talking about the frame of the car. Places where corrosion starts, under the car because you can't see it and you can't really clean it in the same way you could look after the bodywork, and under the wheel arches, what I tend to do is feel behind the wheel arch to see if they're full of mud and dirt.
Hello, we've got Sir Cat joining us.
Indeed. I can't say that it's an expert on motor cars.
No, probably not.
No. So, feel up behind the wheel arches. Again, if they're full of mud and dirt, it's not necessarily the end of the world. I take that as sometimes a sign of how well people clean the car, because with mine I always put a hose pipe up behind those. Pleased to say yours weren't full of mud.
Well, also you'd be pleased to know that when it goes on for its services every year, I have it sprayed with wax oil underneath just to keep it well protected.
Rust protection.
Rust protection, yes.
Indeed. Great idea, and helps prolong the life of the car, and it's not hugely expensive.
No, not at all.
So yeah, that's another point to note. So wheel arches, under the sills, look obviously for signs of corrosion, things like where the windscreen or rear screen meet the body.
Ooh, yes,
because if you get corrosion in those areas, it's then very difficult, A, to repair without taking the screen out, which isn't cheap. B, there's then the risk of cracking the screen, so you need a new windscreen. If you don't do it, you then can end up with leaks getting into the car around where the seal and the corrosion is. Your issue then is, if it gets somewhere in the electronics of the car, you can start getting all kinds of strange electronic malfunctions because there's water getting in.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing there.
You also had a look inside the car and you started the engine. What were you looking for? What particularly were you looking for anyway?
Again, in an ideal world, if you're going to look at a used car, and I would advise at this stage, if you're not perhaps mechanically minded, take someone for a second opinion. If you have got a friend, relative, parent, what have you, who maybe has a bit more experience, it's sometimes good to have a second pair of eyes and ears that might pick up on something that you don't.
This is where Dad might come in useful, you know.
Possibly. So, in an ideal world, you'd like to start the car from cold rather than warm. And preferably when there's two of you, one can then observe the colour of the smoke out the exhaust pipe.
So would you be a bit suspicious if you arrived and the engine had clearly been running and was warm? Would you ask the question why?
I'd possibly, if I was making an appointment with someone, I'm coming at 10 o'clock this morning to view the car, I would probably say in the nicest possible sense, could you just make sure the engine's cold and so on when I come to look at it, because I would like to start it from cold. If somebody's got an objection to that,
you'd be suspicious, wouldn't
yeah,
you?
because there's no objection to that.
Going back to my thing, accept nothing, believe no one, check everything.
Indeed, indeed. You've got to work out with the sale of a car, whether it's one that's been traded in with a dealer and subsequently resold, whether it's the home trader, whether it's a trader with premises, whether it's the private seller. The car is for sale for a reason. That reason might be perfectly innocent. They need a 7-seater. The car's too big, the car's too small, they change the car every 3 years, they've retired and don't do as many miles. Any of the above. It could also be either the car's had a failure and let them down. It could be they've had warnings when they've taken it in for service from the mechanic that it's going to start costing you money now. It's going to need this, this and this.
Get rid.
Sometimes the MOT advisories help with that.
Yeah.
If there's a lot of things that could potentially be expensive. So as Paul's saying there, whilst don't be openly hostile, be wary, don't take anything immediately at face value. So, engine, what I was saying there, starting it from cold. If there's smoke that appears blue, that's oil smoke.
Yeah.
If you're starting it from cold and it looks white, like steam, generally that's just water vapour in the exhaust system.
So nothing to worry about.
Nothing to worry about if it's white. What it should do once the car's been running for a few minutes and it's up to temperature and the exhaust system's got hot, that should just go back to the normal smoke you see coming out of the tailpipe. Other things with relation to that, if you're going viewing one privately, or even if not privately, look where the car's been parked or where it's parked now, look under it for any signs of fresh fluid or oil leaks.
That's a good one, that, yes.
Indeed.
You know, I often do that. For my own car, I just reverse back and just make sure there's no oil leaks, because sometimes you get worried because oil leaks can be very expensive. Unfortunately, my car has no signs of oil leaks on the path where I park it.
So again, oil or fluid leaks. On a note there, if the car has air conditioning and you run the car, if you see water, that's just a byproduct of the air conditioning system running. It has a condenser and it produces clean water. I wouldn't suggest tasting it to ascertain that, but basically usually if there is fluid, touch it with your finger, rub it between thumb and forefinger. If it's oily, it's engine fluids, it could be oil, it could be gearbox oil, it could be power steering fluid. If it's just water with no sign of any colour in it, it's probably just from the aircon condenser. So don't dismiss a car coming back from a test drive, parking it up and saying, oh, there's water dripping from it. It might just be something perfectly innocent. Again, with starting it up, you're listening for noise, any untoward rattles, squeals, knocking noises, anything that doesn't sound right mechanically. Again, the more you look at of a particular model, if you've had a look at a few, you'll rapidly notice one if it sounds radically different in a bad way. If it's the first one...
This is why you really need to look at more than one car.
Indeed, indeed. The temptation is always just to, not necessarily buy the first one you see, but if it's not an enjoyable experience for you, if you just want to get a car to get mobile and I've got transport and I don't want to devote any more time than necessary, this is why a lot of people will buy from a dealer or an established trader, basically for the perceived, and in some cases real, benefits and after sales and perception that they don't need to do the legwork because the dealer's done it before selling the car.
Yeah.
In some cases that isn't always true, but anyway, that's a
Another thing I noticed
conversation.
when you were sat in the car was that you were looking. You looked in the glove compartment.
Okay, so again, usually just as a preamble to that, what I would normally say if that was your private car and I was looking to buy it, I would have probably said, is the service history in the vehicle, rather than just open your glove box.
Right, now-
because if I find a gun in there, we're going to have an awkward conversation.
Now, John, I have to say to you, I as a previous dealer, the service history is lost, and I know that more modern cars you can get that online.
Yeah.
However, I have got lots of bills and receipts. Is that comforting?
Yes, again, depending on the age and the price you're paying, you've got to be realistic. In an ideal world, you would love either printouts of the manufacturer's online service histories for cars that no longer have a service book, or for cars that do, or older cars, you'd love to be able to open it and see exactly on the schedule it should have been serviced, on the right dates and mileage, a dealer stamp from a dealer that you can verify is a franchised or competent dealer. That's absolute nirvana. The older a car gets and the more owners it passes through, some people are more fanatical about service history than others. Some people have it serviced but don't seem to realise that keeping
here's the cat again.
We have another cat.
We have another cat.
Or the same cat in
the
this
same
case.
one, yes.
For some people they'll have it serviced but don't seem to realise that at least even keeping an invoice or a service stamp is important. I'm probably both ways. On cars of mine that have online history, I always ask for a printout as well, and I keep the invoice for the work that's been done. On my older cars that have a service book, I make sure I get a stamp, even if it's not from a franchise dealer. Basically, my rule of thumb is if they're not the kind of car servicing outlet that can provide you with a stamp of some kind and sign your service book if you've got one, I probably don't want them servicing the car.
Okay. Following that, you opened the bonnet and you had a look under the bonnet. What sort of things were you looking for there?
Again, a lot of things on modern cars are covered up or shrouded, so you can only do what you can do. We're looking for some obvious signs. Looking under the bonnet, signs of oil leaks that might be dripping into the car or onto what we call the under tray at the bottom of the engine, so they're not landing on the floor. So having a look there for signs of oil leaks. Also water leaks or signs of the vehicle overheating. So for example, most vehicles now, rather than just a radiator for the cooling system, have what we call an expansion tank, usually a clear plastic tank with a minimum and a maximum. One, it's good practice to have a look at that, preferably with the engine cold, to make sure it's not above or below the minimum or maximum. Also, if there's signs of water staining around there or elsewhere under the bonnet, it can tell you that the car has overheated at some point, which also isn't a good sign, and is probably something that prompts a question. Notice the signs of it. Has it overheated? When was that? Has it had anything done? Again, looking for just signs of anything that doesn't look right. Bits of wire taped together, something that that's a bare wire in a place it shouldn't be. You know, does it look like someone who maybe hasn't got much of an idea or not really bothered about what they're doing is working under there? What I would normally do, you notice me I check the dipstick.
Yeah.
Again, in an ideal world, you'd love to see absolutely golden, clear, amber coloured oil. Unfortunately, modern engines, the way they work, generally the oil can end up dirty quite quickly. But you want to make sure the oil is at the right level on the dipstick. Again, not above maximum, not above minimum. Useful point there is most dipsticks have two sets of markings for hot or cold.
Yeah.
So double check that, because if it's above the maximum you might be looking at the cold maximum mark, and when the engine's hot it tends to be above that mark. So
Right.
again, basically, it's a guide. The other thing, I opened the actual oil filler.
Yes,
Now,
I noticed that.
Now,
What do you-
I'd actually, two reasons for that. One, if I'd done it with the engine running, you'll see if there's any inordinate amount of oil smoke coming out
right.
of that
Yeah,
as the engine's running.
yeah.
Little bit of smoke is normal, you get a bit of oil vapour. If it's something that's virtually visible and again bluish in colour, that would suggest that it's using oil, which isn't a good thing. The other one, again, a really old tip, when I looked on the underside of the oil cap, if you get what can best be described as a cream to beige coloured
I have seen
mayonnaise-like
that, yes.
consistency, can indicate two things. One, if the car's only been used for short journeys, it can just be a bit of condensation, so you'd only get a slight trace of that. If there's a lot of it, it can indicate that there's water getting into the oil, which would generally indicate the head gasket's failed,
Right.
which
Expensive job.
expensive job. On some cars, more expensive than you're paying for the car. If if you're buying a run around 500, 1,000, 1,500 pounds, probably walk away from that car unless it's far, far cheaper than it should be, and you've got a concrete quote for doing the work. Again, I would probably say for most people, walk away.
Well,
So
anyway,
that's- yeah.
Anyway, John, he's given us a fantastic insight in what to look for when you're buying a car. And I just want to recap some of these key points. Look around the outside for signs of rust. Doors are fitting and closing properly. The gaps consistent around the doors. Look for things like tyres. These can be remedied quite easily. The cost is not excessive. But if they're unevenly worn, it could be more excessive cost, particularly in the front of the car. Look for the wheels to make sure they're not chipped. Chipped is really bad if the wheels are chipped, but little scratches, that can be done and painted. And check the engine to make sure everything is good in the engine. Also, check the interior and check things like, is there a service record with the car? Or if there's not a service book, make sure you have the bills. Okay, finally, we've decided to buy the car. Well, not quite finally actually, but we've decided to buy the car. What sort of negotiation techniques can you advise our student family viewers to adopt?
Well, just before I touch on negotiation, which I've made some notes, one thing that I would say at the stage where you're arranging to view a car, always stay safe. Make sure when you're going to view a car, it's a place you're going to feel comfortable. I'll meet you at a car park at 11 o'clock at night.
No.
Not good. I'd always say always
Yeah.
go with a friend if you can.
Yeah.
Let people know where you're going and what time you're due back. That might sound a little bit paranoid, but worth knowing. So, negotiation. Some people are comfortable with it, some people aren't. I would always suggest keep it friendly, not confrontational. Because while you want the best price for the item, in this case a car that you're thinking of buying, the person who's selling it also wants the best price. Somewhere in between there may be some compromise. Now, if there are things you found by thoroughly looking around the car that weren't mentioned in the advert, you've got some negotiating room in terms of, well, it needs 2 tyres, which is going to cost approximately, which you hadn't mentioned in the advert, so I've got to factor that in. So you can either use concrete reasons to say the car is, I don't want to pay your asking price because I'm going to have to spend X, Y and Z to get it to the standard I thought it was going to be when I came to look at it. The other one is, if you've the luxury of plenty of cars that you would be happy with in a similar condition at a similar price, you can afford to walk away. If, on the other hand, that's the nicest example you've seen, or the best example, or the only one, or all of the above, you've got to factor in, am I willing to lose the car for X amount? So again, probably stick to your budget or very close to it. Don't go look at cars that are far more expensive and anticipate that the seller is going to drop 20% or something off the price. And that holds true whether it's £500 or £50,000. In my job, there are times when you come across someone who will inquire on a car, you'll build a rapport, you'll speak to them, you'll look at the part exchange, and you'll get to the final bit, and then they'll say, yeah, but I don't want to pay that much for your car, and the amount they want off is so frankly ludicrous, their perception of the profit margin there is in the car, basically everyone's wasted everyone else's time.
Yeah.
So if the car's up for £5,000, you'd be unlikely to get it for £4,000.
Yeah.
You know, so look at cars that are realistically within the scope. If you've done some research and you've found that that car is above the market price, below, or spot on, again, if it's above, is there anything to justify that? Is it lower mileage? Is it better condition? Has it got a full service history where the cheaper ones haven't? Is it a higher level of trim? Again, it's nice to have a car with the extras, but it's very rare that they actually add much to the resale price.
I think a lot of people, when they buy a car, they have they have all these extras on that cost a fortune. But actually, when when you're valuing the car, you're actually only valuing the original
the base model of the car.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I mean, they might add a little bit to the value if you've got certain things, but they're actually nothing like the amount of money paid. So if you're buying a car with all these extras and the person said to you it's got £10,000 of extras, that doesn't mean the car is worth anything like £10,000 more. Probably 1,000 possibly at the most. So beware of people who say that.
Yeah.
People will say to you, oh, it's got all these masses of extras. So it doesn't really add that much value to it second hand, in fact very minimal.
No, indeed. And on older cars, for instance, if you take, say, well, the older Jaguars, satellite navigation at one point was a £2,000 option on a Jaguar. Now the satellite navigation system is so far off the pace in terms of technology, you'd be better with a TomTom or basically the navigation on your phone. So the fact it was a 2,000 option, yeah, it might be novelty value now, but it obviously doesn't add that much to the value. So negotiating, if you are genuinely interested and in a position that if the deal is right you want to buy that car, that's probably the time to say to the seller, look, I'm interested in the car, I've had a look round it, I've had a drive if that's applicable, I've spotted this, this and this, but they wouldn't stop me buying the car. I think perhaps you're a bit optimistic on your pricing, or is there something we can talk about on the price, or I'm ready to buy it if we can come to an agreement. Is there a deal to be had? Sometimes people will literally say, that's the price, take it or leave it. If they're in a position to do that, well, you can't put their arm up the back to take less for the car. If, on the other hand, you've seen the same car advertised for 3 months on Auto Trader and it's still there, odds are there isn't a queue forming to buy the car.
That's an interesting point. Do you know what I do? When I'm looking for a car or looking at cars possibly to buy, I look at how long they've been for sale, and you can actually track, if you make a note of them, how much they've gone down over a period of time. And I've seen some cars go down as much as £2,000 or £3,000 from some dealers over a period of time. So again, it goes back to what John said. Don't rush into it. You know, you should not rush into buying a car. Take your time. It's a lot of money you're parting with. Be sure of what you're buying, and you know, use these negotiating tools that John has just told you, because actually some of the words he used are really good words and good phrases to use. So bear that in mind. Don't rush into it.
I mean, the other thing at the moment, I'm going to use a P word, pandemic. Pre-pandemic, there was a good supply of used cars at all price points. During the pandemic, a lot of people who would normally have used public transport wanted a cheap runabout. What that's done is drive up the price of cars at the lower end of the market. It's also driven them up all the way through to the point where, as a main dealer, sometimes we've got a 12-month-old demonstrator for sale at the price of a new one because the wait on a new one is so long. So, bear in mind, there'll always be a friend, relative, neighbour who says, oh, that car for this much, well, I wouldn't want to give that much for it, it's worth half that. If other similar cars are half that, they're probably right. If not, they're probably thinking what it would have been pre-pandemic. You know, 2 years ago, I would have said, if I had to find a cheap runabout that I could get a year out of, I would probably have said, nothing fancy, but probably £500 to £750 I could have found something by scouring the classifieds and eBay and the local buy and sell sites on the internet. Probably now, yeah, there's still one or two of those around, but those same cars are probably now £1,500 to £2,000.
So you can see how external circumstances can have an impact on the price of car. I didn't realise it would be that much actually, John. That's quite surprising.
It can be. It's steadying a little, but as I say, good quality, cheaper end cars are at a premium because people are still dubious about public transport and so on, and even supposedly, with no lockdowns and so on going on.
Okay, we've decided on the car we want to purchase. Can you give us a few tips on the collection and the payment for the car, particularly if you're buying it from a private or a dealer who is pretending to be private buyer?
Okay, so if you're dealing with a main dealer with a track record and premises and been trading for years, generally the way they operate will be you leave a deposit to secure the car. They will then arrange a date to collect it, and they will normally expect you to make payment either on the day when you collect it or usually the day before.
So bank transfer?
Usually bank transfer. Fewer and fewer companies are now accepting debit cards for final balances. Various reasons for that. Card charges to the dealership's been one of them. So that's dead easy, that's nothing untoward. If the main Ford dealer says to you, well, we want you to pay for it before the day of collection, that's usually not going to raise any flags. That's how they do business. Generally private or the home traders or the smaller dealers, very difficult, because it's all very well there being an element of trust, but the chap or lady selling the car wants to make sure they've got their money, because just as you're thinking the person selling it might be some kind of trickster or criminal trying to get your money, the other is also true. The person selling it doesn't know whether you may or may not be a criminal trying to obtain the car.
And at this point, I'm sure you should be aware that actually getting cash out of the bank is very, very difficult. Even though it might be your own money, they're very reluctant to give you cash for because of drug laundering and things like that. So, getting, if the car, say, is £2,000, you might have difficulty in one go going to the bank and getting £2,000. You might have to go a few times to get the money out, but they're tending to question these days. So cash is probably the way that these people will accept, but actually it's difficult nowadays.
So, back in the old days, you'd either go along with a banker's draft, which for the younger viewers was a piece of paper, like a cheque, promising payment, but from your bank. That used to be cast iron. When I started in the motor trade 20-something years ago, you would accept that on the day of collection like it was cash. Unfortunately, then sophisticated people found ways to print off fake banker's drafts. So most people are reluctant to take those. Cash, well, that's great, but if you're the seller of the car and somebody turns up with £5,000 in £50 notes, aside from the moral question of where's it come from, might be perfectly legitimate. The second question is, well, are they real notes?
That's true, yeah.
So I've literally had situations where friends in the car clubs if they've sold a car for cash, they've literally gone to the bank with the person buying it, and they've paid it into the bank, and the bank have run it through the system to check whether they are real currency. So not really the best for everybody around.
It just shows about this thing of who you can trust, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, back to your ABC.
Yeah.
So, the best way, generally, most private or smaller dealers, if you're not literally buying the car then and there on the day you view it, they will want a deposit of some kind.
It's just fair enough.
Purely and simply, they've probably had umpteen people come and view the car who said, right, okay, I'm just going to wait to check the insurance, or I'm just going to go and have a word with my dad, brother, uncle, cousin, sister, car trader, whoever, and I'll be right back to you. If they took the car off sale every time that happened, they'd have missed the sale. So don't be surprised if they want something to hold it. Usually, normally gesture of good faith, depending on the price of the car. £100 in the old days I would have left a cheque because it's not quite as untraceable as cash. These days, I don't know, maybe transfer £100 straight into their bank account, and that's probably, when you are collecting the car and paying the balance, that's probably the best way for all concerned. An electronic transfer on the day using your online banking, so you can see it leave your account, they can see it arrive in their account.
Yeah.
Again, as I say, that's probably the best way to do it. If there is a delay between you viewing the car originally and going back however many days or even a week or whatever it might be, going back later, make sure before you do the transfer you check the car again, because it's so easy. If they've still been driving the car in that week, somebody's keyed it, they've scuffed it against something in a car park.
Fair point.
They didn't have an engine management light on the dashboard as a warning last week, but it's just come on.
Yeah.
Once you've given them the money, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Because, you know, some of the old tricks in the trade, it a bit, oh no, we've scraped it. So someone would park it with that side close to a wall or some bushes. So they did.
There are a lot of tricks of the trade. That's a good one. Well, not a good one really, but parking to hide the scratch in the car.
That's occurred since you viewed it. Yeah.
And another thing I've seen dealers do is wash the car and leave it wet because it looks a bit better when
covers up marks, scratches and chips. That's the other thing. If you go to look at a car, if you can, never ever ever go look at a car in the rain. If you can.
Not only will you get wet, but you won't get a good picture of the car.
No, because it covers up. Basically, a decent rain shower is about as good as a £2,000 respray for covering up marks, colour imperfections, anything like that. If you haven't got that option, make sure it's on a car that's not an expensive car. Otherwise, try and see it when it's dry. So, looking at it before, again, just give it a brief check over, checks no warning lights on the dash, make sure that everything that was there, oh, it had a navigation system and a £500 car stereo. Where's that gone? Oh, well, I took that out. That wasn't included in the deal. These type of things. It had didn't ever have alloy wheels on when I came to look at it. It's now got steel wheels and plastic trims. Even down to tyres. This might sound paranoid, but it had 4 nearly new tyres on when I came to look at it, and now it's got 4 not matching part ones that are the right size.
Some of these points that John is making about when you go back to buy the car illustrate how useful it is to take film of what you saw when you looked at the car in the first instance. So if you do decide to buy it, you can compare that film with actually what you're looking at when you go to pick up the car, and that you are buying and paying for the same thing that you looked at originally. I mean, obviously they might not change the colour or change the upholstery, or I doubt whether they do that, but they certainly can change the tyres, they can scrape it, or there can be a light on the dash that wasn't on before, or they could have, when they originally sold it, they could have taken a wire out to stop the light coming on. There's all sorts of tricks of the trade to deceive you, and this is particularly the case, I would say, with the smaller at-home traders, and to a lesser extent the private seller. So do be careful, just look after yourself. Anyway, John, I'd like to thank you for a fantastic, comprehensive guide on what to do when you're buying a second-hand car. And it couldn't really be better, but I think the key thing that you need to learn from this is to make sure that you go through this, what we would call due diligence, and all the things that John's told you, but also make sure that you are confident that you can trust the person, as far as you can tell, who is selling you the car, particularly if it's not a main reputable dealer. And I'm not saying they're all absolutely perfect, but at least they've got a big reputation to maintain and look after. And also make sure that you, once you've bought the car, you look after it, and you've got a budget for looking after it, because it's so important to look after the car and not think, oh well, I'll have to leave it, there's a rattle, I'll leave it. And on that point, just one final point about trust. I go to a particular Jaguar dealer, Jaguar repairer in Preston, and because I trust that repair shop absolutely implicitly, I've actually looked the bloke in the eye who owns it and asked him questions, and he's eyeballed me, and I know I can trust him, and I've used him subsequently quite a lot of times, and I know you can trust him. So not only do you need to find somebody you can trust to buy from, you also need to find somebody you can trust to maintain the vehicle for you, because it's highly unlikely that you're going to be unable to maintain it yourself. Once again, thank you very much to John, and I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I'm sure you're going to have to watch it a few times because there's so much information we've gone through here. John, have you got any last final words for our student family?
Only really, don't rush into anything when you're buying a car. Make sure you think things through. As I say, make sure you stay safe if you're going viewing cars anywhere, really. Also, well, thank you for Paul for hosting this, and if you have any questions, queries, pass them on through Paul. I'll be happy to help.
Oh,
thank you.
You'll be inundated now, John. Thank you very much.